Hey, my name is Shaz Shanghari and welcome to my talk entitled Navigating the Games Industry as a Neurodivergent Person Without Crashing the Fuck Out. A deeply ironic title because I felt like I almost did when it came to putting this together, because it gave me pause to think about my time in the industry and where things are going, especially as everything feels so intense lately, and to be honest, trying not to crash out in this economy is kinda hard. I suppose I should start at the beginning. I'm a non-binary person who goes by they them pronouns. I've been in the games industry for almost 15 years, starting from the revolving door that is quality assurance, dabbled in production, concept design, events and marketing, running into very niche roles such as playtesting engineer. I've worked on console games, mobile and browser games and apps, and dabbled in casino gaming for a time, though the less said about that time, the better. I am also a digital illustrator of 25 years, musician, graphic designer, and content creator, which I started part time about 5 years ago and went full time with it almost 2 years ago when I considered my next steps in games development, except I've actually grown to really like it. Video games are pretty much all I've ever wanted to be involved in since the age of 6 years old. When my uncle introduced me to a Mega Drive and Sonic the Hedgehog for the first time, I knew then that I wanted my name in a Sonic game when I grew up, and maybe even work on a Sonic title or make a video game myself. As you can probably tell based on my skill set and batting around the houses, I have ADHD, which I was diagnosed with officially 5 years ago, and autism, which I was diagnosed with officially a month ago. I decided to get diagnosed officially to finally confirm suspicions, I guess, closure in a way, that there was something different about me. But to be completely honest with you, the signs were always there. I actually want an official study done as to why being a Sonic the Hedgehog fan appears to be a heavy marker for neurodivergency. I grew up in a large working class Caribbean household of 9 people. My mum worked constantly. My grandmother had an early morning job, would return to prepare me, my cousins for school, and then work her second job. My grandfather worked constantly, all to keep us afloat. I was a relatively quiet kid who found video games and spent entire days during the weekends, and was generally very good in school because I found knowledge fascinating. Because my traits were mostly positive, my symptoms were massively overlooked. But we also played outside a lot, so my hyperactivity, or mostly running around like Sonic the Hedgehog, was never really seen by my parents. Also, because of living in a chaotic household, because I wasn't causing havoc, any signs that I may have needed assistance would have been overlooked. That being said, things like inconsistency, not quite reaching potential, being paralyzed by tasks were things that started to crop up in my teenage years. But by then, were just seen as rebelling. So, what can you do? These traits would ultimately see me drop out of college due to the combined pressure of my undiagnosed ADHD symptoms and being the only person in my family at the time to start any sort of education above leaving secondary school. Naturally, I broke, and that breaking was a polarizing time for my family. One of the other issues with Caribbean culture and their thoughts on mental health and disabilities were that they simply didn't exist. The child just needed to try harder. I was misdiagnosed with depression, and I instead decided to seek full time work at the age of 16. My first jobs were in retail, so naturally I started a game. I mean, I still involve video games, right? I would and still do battle with these things, but for the most part, when you have no idea what's happening with you or why you don't seem to be coping with life in the same way as other people, you tend to do your best by masking, desperately trying to mold yourself into what you see, what seemingly normal people around you are doing. In 2010, the start of the dream began. After applying for 3.5 years, I finally landed my first job in the games industry at Sega as a QA tester. Initially, I did incredibly well. The combination of Sonic being a special interest and learning about the game's development process meant that my productivity was huge. I caught the attention of the Sonic team in my first year. I got to work on Sonic Generations, finally achieving my childhood goal of getting my name in a Sonic game, 20th anniversary game no less. But I also got the opportunity to do some brand advisory and game trailer work, which involved working off site with a marketing team. Initially, my enthusiasm was catapulting me to new places and allowing me to talk to people that QA would normally not be allowed to speak to. We worked in a different building from head office, and it was incredibly rare to have in person interactions with producers or members of any development team. But unbeknownst to me at the time, I was garnering the ire of my colleagues, especially my neurotypical ones who thought that maybe favorites were being played and generally overlooked the hard work I was doing across the board. This was my first hurdle in the industry and was the first time I decided to make myself a little smaller in order to make my colleagues feel more comfortable. I tried to keep my head down, feel less excited or enthusiastic about things, and output a little less in terms of logging issues because to them I was showing off. Did this work? No, of course it didn't. What this looked like instead was an inconsistency, and I was pulled aside after some time and spoken to about it. Because my hyperfocus output was so high, any drop-offs looked significant, and as a consequence, my rejection sensitivity kicked in because I felt like I was in trouble and my output became wildly inconsistent as a result. I would recover eventually, and as I went on to do good things after that incident, but feeling like an outsider and a bit of an outcast would continue to plague me. Common patterns were starting to emerge, and as much as they didn't sit well with me, part of me accepted them as a way of life. It was in this that I learned my first lesson. Do not shrink yourself for the sake of other people. For most of us in games or wanting to get into games, it will be a special interest, which means the possibility to excel and rise above others. I quickly learned that rising above the pack in a lot of circles isn't particularly celebrated, especially by neurotypical people, because you're essentially making them look bad. And of course, they are trying to make their way up the ladder too. In the moment, it feels absolutely huge because you need to see and work with these people every day, but ultimately, your feelings matter too, and your progress matters too. It was not the only time that I would shrink myself for the sake of the industry. The second time was applying for a senior tester position, and despite being more than qualified for it, I was called into an office and told point blank that I would not be considered because the way I chose to present myself would mean that my colleagues would not take me seriously. At the time, I had green hair, looked a little emo, which I didn't see as an issue because a lot of my colleagues were alternative to some degree, and that didn't appear to hinder them at all. Against my better judgment, though, I changed up my entire look. This would go on for years until I finally got fed up of masking it and started expressing myself in the way that I wished to, because ultimately it wasn't making me happy. And I was now having to double mask, in a sense. And as expected, it led to burning out far more often. Did it have the desired effect in the way that people interacted with me? Sadly, yeah. But I found that the trade off did absolutely no good for my mental well being and affected the jobs I would go on to do rather wildly. Back then, I didn't put two and two together, but of course, being equipped with the tools I have now, it makes complete sense. So, more on that a little later. After 3 years at my first position, I experienced my second lesson when I was unceremoniously zeroed from my position without warning. In my head, I had always done incredibly well. In my naive hubris, I thought that myself almost exempt. Because this was my first games industry job, I did not know that this was the nature of the beast, not that it should be. I took it personally, very personally, which leads me to lesson two. Do your best not to take setbacks or rejections personally. The spiral is not worth it. In my mind, it didn't matter what I did or how hard I worked, that ultimately I was expendable. Which is, as we all know too well at the moment, and it's absolutely true. But instead of looking at the expendability of talent in the industry as a whole, I looked inward and assumed that it was something to do with me specifically. I now know that this was based on my rejection sensitivity, and if I could have scooped up baby games industry Shaz and shook them by the emo fringe, I would have. We're seeing it happen before our eyes in the industry, especially over the last couple of years, where it doesn't matter if you've released an award-winning banger, it doesn't matter if you've released a bad game, it doesn't matter if you've spent almost a decade of your life making a game only for it to never see the light of day. It doesn't matter if you've been working in an industry for 5 minutes, 5 years, or even your entire adult life. If the money man wants the red money line to go up, you're gonna go. Video games, to me at least, feels like a product of neurodivergency. As games grew, the process needed to be managed, even though most of the time games creation processes feels like it's mostly hot glue, magic, and pure desperation. And before we knew it, we had neurotypical types in the mix, which to a certain extent is needed. But as we all know, there is a massive communication and behavioral disconnect between the two groups because of the refusal of by neurotypicals to meet neurodivergent people in the middle with this. It requires masking whether we like it or not, which 5 days a week is incredibly fucking exhausting. They think we're weird, and we also think they're weird. I use the term neurotypical very loosely because I feel like a person that needs direct eye contact at all times, requires constant prompting in order to continue a conversation, doesn't actually mean what they say, and needs the power of suggestion and double meanings to communicate, doesn't have a constant stream of thoughts processing at all times, doesn't feel normal or typical to me, but who am I to judge? That disconnect would be the sticking point throughout my career. And because of the way that neurotypical archetypes tend to dominate conversations in the workplace, it's easy to shut down and assume that there's something wrong with you specifically and not ask for the help that you need. I feel like this has gotten better within the industry itself over time, where more places are becoming increasingly more mental health and disability aware. but I do believe that there is more work to do in this space, especially it feels like most of the time that getting accommodations made for you can feel like hard work. Very often for us, it feels like almost too little too late, where help is offered where you already feel like you may be in trouble, or worse, actually are in trouble due to inconsistencies in performance or not performing at all due to burnout. For a time, around my 6th or 7th year in, I realized that I needed to change the way I approach work. Essentially, performing a persona 5 out of 7 days a week would mean that I excelled for a good few months professionally, but personally, literally everything else was falling apart. But the biggest red flag for me is that I realized I was not enjoying video games anymore. And then when I tried to address my personal situations, the professional side would flip. The first thing I did for myself was realize that my gender expression and the way I present myself to the world was me unmasking a part of myself, which allowed the social masking to become much easier. So after a long time of looking like somebody else to appease people, I gradually changed my personal style back to the way that suited me. Now, I know that this isn't the case for everyone, but I do believe that there are parts of ourselves, our so-called quirks, that we can unmask in a workspace that makes life a little easier. Sure, some of those things might make people feel weary, but tend to be harmless. And I guess my third lesson is to find yours. It lifted an absolute weight off my shoulders, and as I gained more experience in various fields, I arrived to work as a more confident person. A weirdo to some, sure, but more mentally equipped to make better decisions. And as my confidence grew, being able to advocate for myself became easier, which is an important skill to galvanize yourself for, because sometimes you will find yourself in spaces where people may not necessarily understand where you're coming from and may want to label you as inconsistent or lazy instead. Finding my other neurodivergent friends within the industry has helped me too, and made me feel like I was less alone or that there was less wrong with me. Having ADHD and autism has very often not felt like a superpower to me, which is a cliche we're often spouted, but it is a perspective of living and a source of creativity that I often feel like we need to shrink to a certain degree in order to be seen as acceptable members of society. But as I've grown, I've realized that these traits can be a gift. Deconstructing this and realizing that my time in this industry doesn't have to be this linear, hardline experience. It can be as spontaneous and as random as you like. I took a bit of a beating in the process learning the lessons, and it does take us a little more time, but the more I decided to lean into my needs, the better I performed. My favorite one by far, designated rot day. No tasks, no people, no phone. It's very often the reset that I need after a week of making constant eye contact. Seriously, what is that about? Use all of that holiday, take those mental health days. As a content creator, I have more control of my day to day, which has been an interesting journey because the autism wolf inside me craves structure and the ADHD wolf inside me definitely does not. Ultimately, I've been able to use almost all of my entire roster of seemingly endless talents and half talents that I've started out of ADHD hyperfocus and managed to turn it into something rather beautiful. I've gone on to create things and express things to the world in my own way and work with brands I didn't think I'd ever get to. And I think there's room for all of us to do a bit of that, whichever path we choose in this space. Being diagnosed with late in life with autism and ADHD affords you insights into past behaviors, but can also be a double-edged sword where you constantly question whether or not you could do things differently if you had a different brain. But ultimately, it didn't matter because as weird as this journey has been so far, I wouldn't have gotten this far being anybody else. The title of this talk, probably a bit of a lie. I've had time where I have wanted to or have crashed out. But in the time I have come to realize that the more I have been willing to wave the flag, the more I found people like me and in turn reasons to stay. The overarching lesson is that, like it or not, this industry needs us weird, creative, spontaneous individuals to thrive. So please bring a little bit of yourself to everything that you do. Thank you so much for listening.